All right, now on to our final section of the overview of forensic entomology. We are going to be looking at medico-criminal entomology. So this has to do with insects at, say, a crime scene. So we've looked at the insects that are in food. We've looked at the insects in an urban environment. Medico-criminal entomology, also known as medico-legal entomology, has to do with those bugs that are feeding on human or animal remains. So medico-criminal entomology is actually a really broad thing. There's a lot of information that you can get from the insects that show up at a crime scene. So when we talk about medico-criminal entomology, it is simply the use of arthropod evidence in crime. That's as generic as it gets, right? So there's not a specific thing that we're going for here. We do tend to think of medico-criminal entomology as generally on human remains, although more and more recently we've been dealing with animals. So pretty recently, the FBI has started tracking animal abuse and animal death cases because that's one of those precursors to somebody who may become a serial killer or might do worse crimes later. There's also entire labs dedicated to wildlife forensics, and entomology is very, very useful in those things. However, historically and currently, medico-criminal entomology is used on human remains or on human abuse cases, things of that nature. Now, the number one thing that we get asked to do as a medico-criminal entomologist is, how long has this guy been dead? So we call that the post-mortem interval estimation. Now, we'll talk a lot about this during the semester, but I put this up here simply because this is what I get asked. I'll get a call to go to a crime scene, and they'll ask, how long has this person been dead? What's this post-mortem interval estimation, also known as PMI? Now, what I personally do is something called time of colonization. So the time of colonization estimation can equal the post-mortem interval estimation or the post-mortem interval. It's just looking at the bugs instead of the body. Don't worry, I'll go into this way more in a little bit. But that's the number one thing I do. How long has this person been dead based on how old the insects are? But you don't want to be penned in by just thinking that's all we can do. Instead, there's a lot more information that can come from the insects on a body. So we can do things like cause and manner of death. So I'm basically just going to be telling you stories throughout the semester. Hope that's okay. Should be. You're my captive audience right now. So cause and manner of death. I was working a case once, and actually this wasn't actually my case. This was just, I had a friend who worked at a medical examiner's office. And when you have friends in these different areas, if there's a really neat case and you are also cleared to go to a crime scene, you tend to get phone calls like, hey, Dr. Brundage, there's this really cool thing. And in this case, there was a guy who was driving between two large cities. And the cities had a 5-lane freeway in between them. And so it was big open space, no stoplights, nothing like that. This guy was working the swing shift. So he worked at night. And he'd been doing so for many, many years. It'd been a long time. So it wasn't like he was tired or not used to this thing. This is what he did. So he was driving. There was no traffic reported that night. There was no evidence that he had hit a deer or had any issues. There was no evidence he had, say, a seizure behind the wheel. Basically, what happened was he was driving. Suddenly, he lost control of his car. It flipped, and his brains ended up in the back seat. So fun. Now, I got a call because my medical examiner friend was at the scene and the brains were in the back seat and they had been infested by maggots. And that was pretty neat. There really wasn't much I could tell. They knew when he died, all of that sort of stuff. So they were just like, you want to see some brains in the back seat and maggots in it? And I went, yeah. So I went out there and that was fun to do. But the thing was, they couldn't quite figure out how this person had died. What happened? Was it accidental? Was it purposeful? Did he commit suicide? What was going on? So we're speaking to the manner of death here, right? So in this case, we're looking at all that sort of stuff. They couldn't figure out what had happened. He wasn't sleepy. Nothing like that. Now, what we did find was on the dashboard was a dead wasp. So think about what is going on here. How do you react when there's a wasp in your car? Are you nice and calm? You pull over? Or do you do what this person likely did and just freak out? So what happened here likely was this guy worked at night. He had a wasp in his car. It was kind of chilly out. That wasp is affected by heat. And so when it's nice and cold, she goes to sleep. Now I say she, and you'll learn this in a little bit, but anything that stings you is female. It's the ovipositor. So now you know. So she fell asleep. And when he got in the car to go to his lunch hour, he turned on the heater. She started waking up with the heat, all good. And then she was flying around. Now, wasps, most of them are actually pretty gentle. If you don't bother them, they're not going to bother you. What likely happened was she sort of flew up into the front seat. He kind of started swatting at her and she got angry and stung the ever-living crap out of him. So they did find a sting mark on his neck. So what likely happened is he freaked out. She stung him. He lost control of the car. His brains ended up in the back seat. So moral of the story is if there's a wasp in your car, pull over calmly. And then there. So this manner of death was an accident due to just freaking out because of the wasp. Neat. Now, cause of death, things like that. As a body decomposes, you're going to start to see changes in wounds. You won't be able to tell, say, stab wounds or things of that nature. However, insects will colonize a body at natural bodily openings. So eyes, nose, ears, mouth, vaginal, and anal openings. And at wounds. So when I look at a body, I expect to see a lot of maggots in the head, a lot of maggots in sort of the abdominal, lower abdominal region. I don't expect them to see in the middle of the chest. I don't expect to see them in the palms of the hands. So you see something in the palms of the hand. You see something in, say, the upper right quadrant of the chest. You see something in the back of the head. That's indicative of a big old wound there, and you can talk about, oh, look, those are defensive wounds in the hands, perhaps. Or somebody was shot in the back of the head. Oh, another story. Another friend of mine. Oh, man. So she was at the crime scene, and this woman had been shot, and it was execution style. So she had a big, not a shotgun blast, but a 9mm, I think, in the back of her head. So she was shot in the back of the head, big old hole. There was somebody new on scene, and there were a bunch of maggots in this person's brain, this dead person's brain. And so this new person at the scene saw the hole in the skull and said, oh, look, the maggots ate their way in. And my friend just had to call me what? No, maggots don't eat bone. Just to throw that out there. They are entering in at these openings. And so there was just a couple minutes of, no. And then she had to call me and we had to laugh. It was a whole thing. So don't say stupid things at the scene, I think is really what I'm going on here. Anyhow, you can do cause and manner of death. Now, location of death. So insects show up at a specific time and last a specific amount of time, depending on time of year and location of the body. So the insects that I have here in Texas are going to be different from those that you see down there in Florida or that you see in northern areas of the US or in Canada, or very different from what we're seeing in Europe, Malaysia, Australia. So there's a very neat opportunity, shall we say, to figure out if somebody has been moved. And there's a pretty famous case written about one of the books by one of the more famous forensic entomologists, where a woman was killed by her boyfriend. He lived in Long Beach, California. He shot her with a shotgun, put her under his bed, as I guess one does with the dead body, until she started to decompose, in which case he threw her in the car and took her out to Death Valley in order to dump the body. Now, as you might imagine, the flies and the insects that are there on the coast in Long Beach are very different from those that are inland in Death Valley, in this desert. So when they found the body, she had this big old open wound on her chest. She had a bunch of maggots that were already there, but they were dead. They were older maggots that were dead. And then she had very young maggots that were alive. So what this showed was that she had died at some point. These maggots had showed up to colonize the body. And then they'd been put in a situation where there was no way that they could survive. It was too hot in this case. Then, as they died, new maggots came in and said, hey, look at this body, we're going to feed on it. And so they were able to look at both the new maggots, which were native to Death Valley, the old maggots, which could not be found in Death Valley at all, and try to figure out where they came from. Turns out they came from the coast, and her boyfriend just happened to live on the coast. So that helps them figure out where this body came from. All right, unexplained accidents, told you about that. Insects used for harm. So, are you or do you know somebody who happens to be allergic to insects? The most common one is bees, ants, and wasps. And if you know somebody who's deathly allergic, they often have to carry an EpiPen with them, right? So if they get stung, they can go into anaphylactic shock. Now, if you think about it, that's a fantastic way to kill somebody. If I knew somebody who I didn't want around anymore, not saying that I do for FBI who's listening, but if I did, it'd be really easy to kill them. So a forensic entomologist's job in this case is to determine, does it make sense that these bugs were here at this time to allow this person to die? I mean, we're talking about, they have a full, wasp nest in their bedroom. Does it make sense that it was there without them noticing? Is it something that would happen naturally? That's the type of thing we're looking at, or did somebody put it there? Finally, antemortem drug ingestion. We'll look at this a little bit at the end of the semester, but insects literally are what they eat. Since they show up on a dead body, they're feeding on that body and anything that is in that body. Now, insects don't have the same systems that we do. They don't have a liver, they don't have kidneys, they have something sort of akin to those things, but they don't deactivate and get rid of chemicals the same way we do. So if a body has foreign substances in it, like drugs or alcohol or something of that nature, the insects are going to get that into their system. Now, there are certain drugs that will cause really weird development in insects. Other drugs don't really do anything to them, but they can't get rid of it. They can't deactivate it. So what they do is they sequester it. They take it and they hide it out in their fat bodies. So they have these fat bodies, these little pockets of fat in their abdominal region, and they use that just to store things. They store energy and they store stuff they can't deal with. So if you have a person who died of, say, a cocaine overdose, right? These maggots going to be feeding on this body. They can't deactivate that cocaine, and so they just sequester it into the fat bodies. Once a body has started to really decompose, we cannot test that body for cocaine. What we can do is we can test the maggots. We can test the beetles that are feeding on that body, all those sorts of things. Now, we can also test the pupal casings. And when we get into development of insects, I will show you all about the pupal casings. But since these insects can't get rid of this cocaine, it's going to show up everywhere. So if you have a fully skeletonized body, no flesh left to test, but there's a bunch of pupal casings, a bunch of dead maggot bodies around, that sort of thing, you can test them and see if there was cocaine in that body. The problem with this is that you can't decide if somebody was, died of an overdose of cocaine because of bioaccumulation. So since the maggots continue feeding and they just keep sequestering this substance, you can't say, yes, this person had this amount of cocaine in their system. No, it's accumulating in the bugs. So what you have to say is it is present or it isn't. It's basically a yes or no question. Was there alcohol? Was there antidepressants? Were there some sort of opioid or something like that in their system? Yes or no, but we can't do how much. So there's a lot that medical criminal entomology can tell us about a crime scene. And once you know the insects, then you know what is going on there. Now, we are going to focus this semester specifically on the number one question that I get asked, which is how long has this person been dead, or this time of colonization estimation. Okay, so this is based on some pretty simple assumptions. So the first is that flies may colonize a body within 15 seconds of death. Now, I say may simply because a lot of research has gone into, okay, we're going to shoot a pig. We're going to put out a meat. We're going to put something out and see how long it takes the flies to show up, decide that this is a great resource for their babies, and lay eggs. This is what's going to happen there. So a lot of anecdotal evidence has shown they show up very, very quickly after death. Now, there may be reasons that they do not show up right after death. And I bet you can think of a bunch right now, right? And some of them are things like, let's say somebody died and then they wrapped them up in a whole bunch of plastic and put them in a freezer. Flies aren't going to be able to get in there. Sometimes cars are very airtight or very insect proof. So somebody dying in a car, well, especially newer models, and they don't have the vents open, they don't have any windows open, there we go. They're not able to get in. If they are wrapped so tightly and even dumped outside, or maybe they're buried really deep. There's a bunch of reasons why insects may not show up right after death. We've also seen, this is fascinating. We've also seen some really neat things going on at body farms. So body farms are places at universities usually where people can will their body and they're set out to decompose, and we can watch them decompose and run some research on them to help the future. It's pretty neat. But we found that people who have been undergoing chemotherapy do not attract insects. They just mummify really quickly. And so it's that all those chemicals and stuff in their body are killing off all the bacteria, killing off all those things that are attracting the insects and basically telling the insects, yes, this person is dead. Neat. Okay, so anyhow, so these flies may colonize the body within 15 seconds of death. If they do, so assuming this body has been out there and at the moment of death, a fly showed up, those flies and their subsequent eggs and larvae are going to last a specific amount of time and show up in a specific order, depending on time of year, temperature, and location of the body. So let me say that again. The flies are going to show up at this body very, very quickly as soon as what it is available for colonization, right? So as long as it's not in a freezer or in a car or really wrapped or whatever, let's say somebody's outside, they just drop dead. Flies are going to be there and they're going to show up and they're going to lay their eggs on that body. Now, the first flies to show up, those are the ones that really like fresh meat. There are other flies out there that like meat a little more, seasoned, shall we say, a little more rotten. There are beetles that like it super, super rotten. There are flies that like it really, really dry. So there's all these different preferences for these flies, just like you like different types of food, different types of meat. Say you like it really rare, you like it well done, whatever. Flies are the exact same way. So certain flies will show up first. Now, flies are extremely dependent on temperature, and we will go into this just ad nauseum, trust me. Okay, they're extremely dependent on temperature. They can't regulate their own temperature the way that we can. Instead, the warmer it is, the faster flies are going to grow, and the more flies are going to move around, while the colder it is, the less they're going to grow or the slower they're going to grow, and you won't see them as much. That's why during really cold months of the year, really wintry times, if it's nice and cold out, you can walk outside. You won't see bugs flying around. You won't hear crickets or cicadas or anything like that outside. Now, during the summer, they're freaking everywhere. Nice and warm, they can handle it, great. Cold, they can't. Now, because of that, there are certain flies that are really, really adapted to really warm times of the year. Others are adapted to cooler times. There are a couple of insects that can handle super cold things, just not many. There are certain flies that we only see happen, say, in the fall and early winter months here in the south. But they are summer flies up in the north because it's the same temperature here in the winter and summer in the north. Okay. So depending on the temperature outside, depending on the state of the body, and depending on the location of the body. So again, remember I just talked about how certain insects show up at different areas. So there are insects that like, say, the big city. Other insects like rural areas. I did some research back in California where there was a difference between the flies, especially that were up on mountains versus ones that were by the river versus ones that were in the middle of the city. So you could tell where this body was based on the massive amounts of flies that were on that body. So all these things come into play. And assuming that you know what flies are supposed to be there, assuming that the flies could get to the body, then we assume that insect colonization may equal the time of death. So you will hear me talking about time of colonization estimation as opposed to postmortem interval. Okay, so postmortem interval estimation is something that is specific to the body in my mind. So this is something that medical examiners do. They use the potassium in the eye. They use rigor mortis. They use algor mortis. They use other methods to determine how long a body has been dead, to determine the postmortem interval using the systems of the body. Since I'm not using the body, I'm using the bugs, I can only tell you how long a body has been dead based on when those insects showed up. So I'm looking at what point they colonized the body or their time of colonization. All things being equal, that equals the postmortem interval. However, I don't know if that body was kept in a freezer for 10 years before it was dumped outside and available for colonization. I don't know if it was wrapped in a car. I don't know what happened. If I did, I'd probably be the one who killed him. So I don't know that. So that is why I say time of colonization estimation. This will actually be one of your discussion questions later on in the semester. What do you think and why? Now, there are other insects that are associated with the body. So flies are usually the most important, but we also see things like ants and cockroaches and beetles and moths, a whole bunch of other things, and we will talk about quite a few of these later on in the semester. Now, this is basically what we're looking at in forensic entomology. We are looking at the blowfly life cycle, and you will know what a blowfly is in a couple of weeks once we get to that family. But this life cycle is very simple. The adult female will show up at a body. She will lay her eggs. Those eggs will hatch out into maggots. Those maggots will feed on the body for a long time. They will pupate, and then they will turn again into adult flies. Now, that table down at the bottom here, this shows you the different families of insect that we expect to show up at different stages of decomp. So this is a very simplified table, very simplified group of decomposition stages. Starts with fresh, goes on to bloat, into active decay, and then finally dry. So we tend to see the flies showing up in fresh and then especially in that bloated and active decay. As it moves into later decay and into dry stages, we tend to see more beetles. But that depends on time of year, temperature, all that sort of stuff. So we can use both the life cycle of the blowfly and what we call these decomposition stages or the succession of different insects in order to figure out how long a body has been available for colonization. This semester, however, we're going to focus specifically on using the blowfly life cycle. So this is my bread and butter when I do crime scene. Most of the time, I'm talking 99% of the time, someone will send me a case. It'll have a bunch of maggots in it. They'll say, how long has this person been dead? So I try to figure out how old the maggots are based on the temperature. And we'll go into this again ad nauseum, but I want you to see it first right now, just so you know what I'm talking about, just to get you ready, prepped. So what happens is flies are what we call poikilothermic. So poikilothermic means that they do not control their own bodily temperature. The warmer it is, the faster they grow. The colder it is, the slower they grow. So just to give you an example, this here is the life cycle of the black blowfly. This is Phormia regina. So this black blowfly, this female shows up. She will lay her eggs. And let's say it is at 70 degrees Fahrenheit all the time. Beautiful day, beautiful night, whatever. So the female will lay her eggs. At 70 degrees, it'll take 23 hours for those eggs to hatch. They will hatch into the first of what we call 3 larval instars. An instar is simply a stage of larval development. Don't worry, you will see this word again. So the eggs hatch into the first larval instar. Okay? Then that larval instar will feed. It'll grow. At 70 degrees, it takes 27 hours to get through that first stage. It'll then shed its exoskeleton and shed into or close into the second larval instar. That second larval instar takes 22 hours to go through its full stage at 70 degrees. It'll grow into the third larval instar. That third larval instar is nice and big and eats like mad, takes 130 hours. It'll then pupate, and in the pupal stage, it uses enzymes to break down its entire body and build it back up into a fly. And that takes 143 hours. Now, if it was warmer, This would go much faster. So if it was like 90 degrees, you could probably cut this in half. So instead of 23 hours, it'd be what? 12 hours or 11 and a half hours, okay, to go through that egg stage. If it was colder, it would take longer. So this is the basis. Once I know how long it takes at any given temperature for these flies to go through their stages, I can estimate how old they are. And don't worry, we will spend a lot of time learning how to do this. All right, that's it for today. Let me know if you have any questions.